Welcome back to Tocqueville Talks. I'm Brent Nelsen, director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society. And today we're on to something new and different. This is the last week in March, and we had to reschedule an event that we had scheduled for January, and it got snowed out because planes couldn't take off from airports in the north, and so we had to cancel, and we could only get one of our invited guests, Phillip Muñoz from Notre Dame. He's a constitutional scholar, not actually a lawyer, but he teaches in the Notre Dame Law School, but importantly, he is also the Tocqueville Chair in Political Science at Notre Dame as well. So we really like the connection between Phillip Muñoz and ourselves, right, Beth? And my co-host is here as usual.
Yeah, that's where I started at Notre Dame, working with Michael Zuckert, who started that. Actually, I might be misspeaking. He maybe didn't start it, but he was running at the time when I was there, the Tocqueville program there that they had. Mm-hmm. So Phillip Muñoz came in while I was there, so we knew each other, and it was great to reconnect. And he is much happier, I am sure, that he was able to come now at the height of spring in beautiful South Carolina and not during the ice storm, which was weather much more like what he said the Notre Dame experience was this year.
Yes. Well, he was here to talk about the unitary executive, but he also has a wide-ranging set of areas of expertise, including First Amendment rights and especially religious liberty, church and state issues. And so we've really had a wonderful time today. And Beth?
So Phillip and I got a chance to talk about how he came to study the founding and all things constitutional and religious liberty related. He actually started off in medieval theology, which he was led to from Aristotle. And learning about Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics and the virtues in California in the late 80s, where he noticed that there was a kind of absence of discussion of morality and virtue. So that was really interesting to hear about that. I didn't know that about him. And then we went and we discussed a little bit about what it means to even say we have a right and what a right is and how that connects to freedom and what limits there might be on those kinds of rights and freedoms. And then we also talked about what he sees as a difference between the American founding understanding of religious liberty and how that has been interpreted, not just over time, but like how it's moved from branches, like moved locations into the Supreme Court is where we now see that. And he talks about how it used to be the local communities, where in the founding era, this was more a question to be determined. And we ended off with his views on where higher education is at right now when it comes to not just religious liberty, but also the purpose of higher education itself.
Wow, that sounds great. Let's get right into it. This is Beth Larive with Phillip Muñoz.
All right, we are here with Vincent Phillip Muñoz, who is visiting the Tocqueville Center this week and giving a talk on, what are you giving a talk on tonight?
The topic I was given was the unitary executive. Discuss.
That's right.
So I'll be discussing.
Yes. Yeah. I'm super excited. I've been teaching in the American founding, so I'm really excited about this. But did you start off in the American founding, or how did you come to this?
No, not at all. I went to graduate school to study medieval political thought.
This is something I never knew about you. You're a medievalist.
Well, not really. I lasted about a semester. Yeah. No, I read my junior year in college. I read Aristotle's Ethics. I thought this is the most interesting book I've ever read. I've sort of been looking for this. I didn't know I was looking for it, but that's what I was looking for. I still remember it to this day, reading it and thinking, wow, this is interesting.
What stood out to you about it, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, it's just so compelling, the account of the virtues. The idea of habituation and mastering yourself and wanting to become virtuous. Like, it's you read certain books at certain times, and like I was ready for that. Okay. So I graduated from college in the late 80s, went to college, had a great time. It was in Southern California, had lots of free time, did fine in school, had lots of friends. But honestly, it was sort of a very hedonistic lifestyle. Like you just sit around, you read and do your homework and study, and then you're done at 1, and you just goof off. And, it just seemed empty in a way. This is like the whole hookup culture was setting in and everything. It meant something different then than it does now. But it was really like no rules, no structure. The kids were in charge of everything. Mm-hmm. And it just seemed empty to me. Right. And like the purpose of college was to go get a good job and become wealthy. I guess I'm not against that, but it just seemed, And then Aristotle was different. It was serious. It was about making choices well. I don't know that that's really Aristotle's teaching, but that's how I read it. And it was just different than everything else. Right? So I was in a marketing course and in the morning, and then first course was marketing, which I liked. It was interesting. And then I'd go read Aristotle. Mm-hmm. And the difference was so dramatic. Okay. But then I grew up Catholic. I'm like, this book, Aristotle's Ethics, is so compelling. But there's nothing about Christianity in it. Jesus isn't in it. If this is an adequate or compelling account of a good life, why do you need Christianity? Mm-hmm. And that provoked sort of an intellectual crisis for me. And I was told that Thomas Aquinas put these things together, Christianity and Aristotle. But I didn't really know Thomas Aquinas, and there were a few political theorists who actually knew a lot about Thomas Aquinas, but I didn't know that at the time. And so I went to try to go understand Thomas Aquinas. I tried to read it on my own, and that was hard.
Yeah, no. Yeah. I read it in graduate school with David Burrell, actually. It was one of the last classes he taught before he retired. Yeah. And I think for about 3 out of the 4 months, I remember feeling like I was speaking a different language that I didn't know the meaning of. And then in the last month, it did click a little bit.
I think that's probably right. And I wrote my undergraduate thesis on Thomas Aquinas, and I went to Boston College to study with the great Ernest Forden.
That's right.
And really enjoyed that. But eventually, I don't know, maybe I wasn't good enough at it, or Aquinas convinced me that there's a harmony between faith and reason, sufficiently that I didn't have to figure it all out myself. I don't know, that probably reveals my lack of having a philosophic nature. But then I got interested in these questions of morality and law in our own context, and that's what led me to America.
So to continue a little bit from what you were speaking of earlier today, which was kind of what you're thinking about right now and what it means, when we say we have a right, and what does that actually mean? Is that is this kind of where your work has been leading towards, or are you going to continue this, or have you been kind of shaping this yet?
Yeah, well, so I met with a group of students and faculty over lunch. We had lunch and just sat around in a circle and talked, and it was fantastic. So if there are any parents listening to this and you send your kids to Furman, you're getting your money's worth. It was really an interesting conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Good.
So I said we have this notion that rights are trumps. Mm-hmm. If I have a right to free speech, I can say anything I want and no one can stop me. And I don't think that's a compelling understanding of rights, and I don't think it's the founders' original understanding of rights. So I'm trying to understand what they meant when they said that we have rights. What are the grounds of rights, and what are the limits of rights? And the reason I'm asking that question is because rights are just the way that we talk about justice. Mm-hmm. So are there just and unjust ways that one can use one's freedom? That's really the question I'm trying to think through. And I think we all think there are unjust ways you can use your freedom. And then the question is, well, what are those unjust ways, and who decides? Mm-hmm. Who decides if something is a matter of free speech or libel, or free speech or hate speech, one being allowed, the other not being allowed? So there's all sorts of interesting philosophical questions, but also institutional questions.
So could you give one example that sort of illustrates maybe the difference between how the founders thought about this versus how we tend to think about it today?
Yeah, I suspect, and so the question I was asked earlier is, what are you thinking about? This is what I'm thinking about. So I think about things I don't really know. So now you're asking me to give an opinion on something I haven't really fully thought through. So everything I say is somewhat conditional upon further reflection. But I think they had a much less robust conception of free speech. Or that their conception of free speech was not that you could say anything. Certainly it wasn't that you can say anything, and that's not our conception either. But that the community, and local communities, would draw the lines between acceptable and unacceptable speech. That the community was very important, and not that the individual wasn't important, but that we have a much more libertarian understanding of rights than they did, I think.
Interesting. So we could shift to what you have mastered, and that is, could you talk a little bit about your work in religious liberty, and like the religious aspect of the American founding, or how you see the constitutional law?
Yeah, well, let me connect the two topics.
Sure.
So the Supreme Court for a long time interpreted the First Amendment to erect a wall of separation between church and state. There's a strict separation between church and state. So you can't post the Ten Commandments in the classroom, in a public school classroom, or you can't have daily Bible readings or daily prayer in the classroom. These were mandated, it was thought, by the Constitution in the wall of separation of church and state. I think some of that might be right. But I think the founders had a much more limited notion of the First Amendment protections, even if we apply them to the states. That is, the people in their local communities get to decide the moral education of their children, including in the public schools. And that the people in the community can include religious instruction to some degree, or to a large degree. That's what I mean by it's less libertarian and much more, our freedom was much more in communities. In one way, if you didn't like the community, you can move to a different community. So government was more majoritarian and more local, less libertarian than now, and less national than now. So that's just a small concrete example. Now, there are limits. It's not that local communities could do anything, but just a example from an early church-state case. There was a program where in public schools for an hour every week, school children would receive religious instruction. So if you're a Catholic priest or nun would come into the public school. If you're a Protestant minister. If you're Jewish, a Jewish rabbi would come in. Now, the parents selected the religious education for their child, but this was on the public school grounds during the public school day, and if you didn't want your child to get religious education, then they wouldn't go to any religious education. And this was widely spread in America. This happened all over the place. And the Supreme Court put an end to all of that. Now, there might be reasons we don't want religious education in the public schools. I can think of several reasons myself. But the question is, who decides? And if a local community wants to have a program of religious education where different religious traditions can instruct their own kids in the public schools during the public school day, I think that's actually how things were done. There was no right to be free of religion in that way at the founding era. And so that's what I mean by their conceptions of rights were less individualistic and certainly less absolute than we tend to think they are.
Yeah, one line of argument that I heard that was really interesting when looking at it was some of the religious Supreme Court cases from the 60s through the 90s. And it was that separation of church and state has been interpreted in such a way that kind of there's a de facto pushing of atheism because it's been so constrained to have any like public prayer before a public ceremony or any display of Ten Commandments, say, or
you could say that
nativity.
The First Amendment has been read to establish secularism. Mm-hmm. And I that might be descriptively true of how the court at a certain period of time or some justices interpreted the First Amendment, but that's not the original meaning of the First Amendment. And I think that's a mistake in understanding.
So do you have we can take this in whatever direction you like, but there's a huge debate happening right now in the country about whether or not America is a Christian nation. And what does it mean to say that America is a Christian nation? Do you happen to have thoughts or comments on this?
I mean, that's a big question. If we were to start a conversation about it, with an interlocutor, I would ask, what do you mean by any nation being a Christian nation? Mm-hmm. And I say that because it seems to me Christianity is not, first and foremost, a political religion. The Gospels, Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. That implies that Caesar is legitimate, like you should give something to Caesar's, but you have to save or only give to God what is God's. That is, don't give to Caesar's what is God's. Mm-hmm. And there's not a unification of church authority and political authority. So there are two authorities. This is an old story, but there are two authorities. Yeah. And the religious authority, the Christian authority, is not primarily political. And when you say a Christian nation, we're putting those two authorities together. And that strikes me as not quite true to Christianity itself. So that's in a way where I start. So what do you mean by we're a Christian nation? If you mean something like the following, that our law, our fundamental law, recognizes a higher authority above it, and therefore we limit what the state can do. Well, in that sense, yes. And if that makes us a Christian nation, then I guess yes. Okay, if that's too abstract, here's what I mean. If you want to be a high school teacher, you get an education license. If you want to be a doctor, you get a medical license. If you want to be an accountant, you get some sort of a license, right? If you want to be a beautician, you get a cosmetology license. Almost all professions are licensed. Mm-hmm. But religious preachers don't get a preaching license. Mm. And we should think about that. Why, when I ask my students, well, why shouldn't we have preaching licenses? You got to get a marriage license. Mm-hmm. Why not a preaching license? And our answer is, well, that's not the role of government. Government doesn't get to say who is or who is not a legitimate preacher. And then why not? Because there's some things the state can't and shouldn't do. Why shouldn't it do those things? Because there's a different, separate, and higher authority. So if by a Christian nation you mean we limit state authority in light of a higher authority, and that tradition of limiting the state occurred in the context of America, in the context of Christianity, well then yes. Mm. But I don't know that most people, when they use the term, mean that. Mm-hmm. I think, I'll take one other example. We believe, rightfully so, of the dignity of the individual in America. It's a great advancement of Western civilization, that all life is precious, all human life deserves respect, moral respect. Why do we believe that? Well, in part because we believe we're all the children of the one universal God, who's providential and created each of us out of his concern or even his love. That is a very Christian idea. Now, I'm not saying it's exclusively Christian. Christianity's own roots are in Judaism, so I'm not saying it's exclusively Christian. But the idea of the universal dignity of the individual, it's very American, despite of all our country's flaws. It's also very Christian. If you mean, not exclusively Christian, but if you mean, well, we respect the individual. Every individual deserves moral respect. And that's in America primarily through our Christian heritage. If you mean that by that when you say we're a Christian nation, then I would agree. But if you said, well, only Christians could be citizens, or only Christians can immigrate, or only Christians can vote, or only Christians can hold office, more particular and concrete understandings of what it would mean to be a Christian nation, then I disagree, because that's not actually our tradition, or to the extent it is, it's not the best of our tradition.
So what would you say from your work on religious liberty or thinking about, I don't know if it's rights or the dignity of the individual within like the contemporary university? Where do you see students maybe being deficient in understanding, or the environment of the college campus itself? Where do you direct these thoughts when it comes to actually educating college students at this time? I think about what you're saying, and it depends on a distinction between what is political and what is not political. Mm-hmm. And I look at a college campus, and one of the things that I see is that everything is conceived of as political. So what one of the things teaching, great books like I teach, for example, and like you teach as well, probably somewhat different set. I'm more ancient, but is like just to try to communicate what is it? How there are different spheres of life, mm-hmm. to open them to that, and that not everything is a political category.
Yeah, what I used to think a lot, and this is abating somewhat now, which I'm happy about, but it used to be, even at Notre Dame, though maybe not at Notre Dame as much as elsewhere, but even at Notre Dame, a lot of comments in class would begin as a woman or man or Latino or first generation student, as a this, I think so-and-so, that my thoughts are a product of my identity. And what's first and foremost is my identity, or my identity shades everything. That was both used as an aggressive way, meaning if you don't share that identity, then you can't question my perspective. And you could say as a more modest, well, this is how I come at those things. And I always thought that the purpose of education was to have us try to think, as a rational human being who tries to think in a objective manner without prejudices, understanding we all come from somewhere with certain perspectives and everything. So there is a sense in which you say, well, as recognizing your own limitations. But the identity became so strong. And there was also a belief, as a this, and you are a that, we just can't really see where the other person is coming from. Mm-hmm. And how that affected the classroom was, well, this author, who Thomas Jefferson or Abraham Lincoln or Frederick Douglass, wrote as a this. And therefore, their thought was limited or only relevant to the people who shared that identity. This person can't teach me anything. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a great crime perpetrated on students. To tell a minority kid that Plato doesn't write for them is to deprive them of the experience of learning from Plato. And it's one of the worst things we can do to young people.
Well, and that's exactly, just to bring back around to the discussion that we had earlier today with students here, that's exactly what I saw you doing with the conversation about rights, is getting at the argument. This wasn't about presenting, competing doctrines of rights, like that comes up in the course of conversation, but you really need to focus on the arguments. And that's, I would completely agree, where education really serves students is they need to understand the arguments for themselves. They can understand them, and they do have that capacity because they have reason. Yeah. I think that's a great place to end. So thank you very much for being here.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Tocqueville Talks. This episode was produced by Audrey Enghauser. Lucy Southwell provided administrative support. The theme music is called "The Girl I Left Behind Me," a popular folk song in early 19th century America, here performed by Jacob Taylor Armerding. To learn more about our lecture series and events, our Tocqueville and Beaumont Fellows programs for undergraduates, and to listen to episodes, watch event recordings, or support our work, search on Google for the Tocqueville Center at Furman University. If you enjoyed the episode, please like, subscribe, comment, and share Tocqueville Talks on all your favorite listening services. And visit our YouTube channel for full recordings of past events and episodes. Until next time, goodbye.